Veteran Joe searched for peace in the Appalachian wilderness, but his only companion, a dog named Arrow, found trouble instead. During a hunt, Arrow suddenly ignored their prey, pulling Joe toward a dense ravine. What they found left Joe stunned, a forgotten tomb of steel. Deep in the forest, the wreck of an Apache attack helicopter emerged, covered in vines like a monster that had been sleeping for decades. Joe didn't know that this was no accident. He had just uncovered a deadly secret, and his life of solitude was over as a ruthless hunt, with him as the target, was about to begin. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The morning sun crested the peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, casting long, cool shadows across the hollow where the log cabin stood. It was a small, sturdy structure, built by hands that knew the language of wood and stone, a solitary outpost against the vast, untamed wilderness of West Virginia. For the man who lived there, it was both a sanctuary and a self-imposed prison. His name was Joe. A former Marine, he had traded the arid landscapes of Afghanistan for the dense, whispering forests of home. But the ghosts of war had followed him across the ocean. He was in his early 40s, with a tall, lean frame that still held the disciplined strength of his service. His short brown hair was streaked with silver at the temples, a premature map of the burdens he carried. His face, framed by a neatly trimmed but rugged beard, was a study in contrasts. Harsh lines, etched by sun and stress, were softened by kind, deep-set, hazel eyes that often held a distant, haunted look. This morning, he wore his usual attire for the cooler mountain air, a faded navy, gray, and pale beige plaid shirt over a plain gray t-shirt, worn denim jeans, and a pair of scuffed but solid work boots. A low whine broke the quiet of the cabin. Joe looked down from the porch where he was sipping his coffee. Lying at his feet was Arrow, a magnificent German shepherd of about 4 years. His coat was a striking blend of slate gray and snow white, and his intelligent amber eyes were fixed on Joe's face, mirroring his master's pensive mood. Arrow was more than a dog. He was an anchor, a silent confidant who understood the unspoken language of Joe's pain. He had been with Joe since he was a pup, a furry, clumsy bundle of energy that had grown into a loyal and perceptive guardian. Joe reached down and stroked Arrow's head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur behind the dog's alert ears. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Just watching the sun come up." Arrow responded with a soft thump of his tail against the wooden planks. He could sense the familiar tension in Joe, the invisible tremors that sometimes ran through his hands, the way his jaw would clench when a memory surfaced unbidden. In those moments, Arrow would press his body close, a warm, living weight that grounded Joe in the present, pulling him back from the precipice of the past. The bond between them was forged in silence and mutual understanding. Joe had rescued Arrow from a local shelter not long after his honorable discharge in 2019. A man seeking a reason to keep going. In turn, Arrow had rescued Joe right back, giving him a purpose, a steady heartbeat to focus on when the world dissolved into chaos inside his head. After finishing his coffee, Joe stood and stretched, the movement fluid and economical. "Time to go, buddy. Let's see what the woods have for us." The words sparked immediate excitement in Arrow. He sprang to his feet, his tail now wagging with purpose, a soft bark escaping his throat. A multi-day hunting trip was their ritual, a pilgrimage into the heart of the wilderness. It was more than a hunt for sustenance. It was a form of therapy. Out there, in the profound silence of the ancient forest, the noise in Joe's mind would sometimes quiet down. The complex demands of tracking, survival, and awareness focused his thoughts, leaving little room for the intrusive echoes of firefights and loss. Inside the cabin, they moved with practiced efficiency. Joe checked his rifle, a bolt-action he had owned for years, cleaning and oiling it with a meticulous care born from years of treating his weapon as an extension of his own body. He packed their supplies: dried rations, a water filter, a first aid kit, a compass, and a well-worn map. Every item had its place, every action a deliberate purpose. Arrow watched intently, occasionally nudging Joe's hand with his wet nose as if to offer his assistance. With their packs ready and his rifle slung over his shoulder, Joe did a final check of the cabin, securing the windows and locking the heavy wooden door. He paused on the porch, taking one last look at his small haven before turning towards the endless sea of green. He gave a low whistle. Arrow was already at the edge of the tree line, waiting patiently. He looked back at Joe, a silent question in his eyes. Joe nodded, and together they stepped off the cleared land and were swallowed by the forest. The air grew cooler under the dense canopy of oak, maple, and pine. The only sounds were the crunch of their footsteps on the leafy ground, the distant call of a bird, and the whisper of the wind through the high branches. They walked for hours, moving deeper into territory few people ever ventured into. This was where Joe felt most alive and, paradoxically, most at peace. He relied on his training, on the instincts honed in a different kind of wilderness, to navigate the terrain. But Arrow was his true guide. The dog's senses were a constant living sonar, detecting the faintest scent on the breeze, the snap of a twig far off the trail. Joe had learned to trust Arrow's instincts as much as his own. As dusk began to settle on their first day, Joe found a suitable spot to make camp near a small, clear stream. While he set up a simple lean-to and started a small, contained fire, Arrow patrolled the perimeter, his ears swiveling, his nose testing the air. He was on watch, a silent sentinel ensuring their small circle of light remained safe. Later, as they sat by the crackling fire, sharing a piece of jerky, Joe stared into the flames. In the dancing light, he saw flickers of another place, another time. The sharp crack of a burning log sounded too much like gunfire, and for a fleeting second, the scent of pine was replaced by the acrid smell of dust and cordite. His breath hitched. Instantly, Arrow was beside him, pushing his head firmly under Joe's hand. The dog let out a soft, deep whine, a sound of pure comfort. Joe blinked, the forest returning to focus around him. He took a deep, shaky breath and wrapped his arm around his companion. "I'm okay, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to you, I'm always okay." He leaned his head back against a large oak tree, Arrow's warm presence, a solid shield against the darkness, both within and without. The hunt had begun. The therapy was working. Dawn broke cold and sharp, the light filtering through the thick canopy in muted gray beams. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing embers, and a light mist clung to the forest floor, muffling the world in a damp silence. Joe woke slowly, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. Arrow was already awake, sitting perfectly still beside him, his breath pluming in the chilly air. The dog's amber eyes were alert, scanning the surrounding woods with an intensity that spoke of his protective nature. After a meager breakfast of cold jerky and filtered stream water, they packed up their camp, leaving no trace of their presence behind. The hunt resumed. For hours, they moved as one entity, a man and his dog navigating the primeval landscape. Joe's focus was absolute, his senses sharpened by the wilderness. He read the signs of the forest: a bent twig, a scuff in the dirt, the faint, musky scent of deer carried on the wind. By mid-morning, their patience was rewarded. Joe spotted the tracks, fresh and clear, in a patch of soft earth. A white-tailed deer, and a large one from the depth of the hoof prints. He knelt, examining the trail, while Arrow stood beside him, his body quivering with restrained excitement, his nose twitching as he sorted through the complex tapestry of smells. "Good boy," Joe whispered, giving Arrow a reassuring pat. "Let's be quiet now." They began to track their quarry, moving with a stealth that was second nature to them both. Joe's steps were measured and silent, his movements economical. Arrow glided through the underbrush like a gray phantom, his paws making no sound on the thick layer of fallen leaves. The forest seemed to hold its breath with them. They followed the trail up a gentle slope, through a grove of ancient hemlocks, and across a rocky outcrop that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. The tracks led them down into a denser part of the woods where sunlight struggled to pierce the thick ceiling of leaves. It was here, as they closed in on their prey, that something shifted. Arrow, who had been the picture of disciplined focus, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His head went up, his ears swiveled, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Joe froze, his hand tightening on his rifle. He scanned the trees, his eyes searching for any sign of a bear or another predator, but he saw nothing, heard nothing but the gentle rustle of leaves. The deer tracks continued straight ahead. "What is it, boy?" Joe murmured, his voice barely a breath. Arrow ignored the deer trail completely. He turned his head sharply to the left, toward a part of the forest that was even thicker and darker, a tangle of rhododendron and thorny vines that descended into a steep, shadowed ravine. He let out a sharp, insistent bark, a sound he rarely made while hunting. It was a bark of alarm, of discovery. He looked back at Joe, his intelligent eyes pleading. Then he barked again and took a few steps toward the ravine, pulling against an invisible leash. Joe felt a prickle of unease. This was not normal behavior. Arrow was the most disciplined hunting partner he had ever known. To abandon a fresh trail like this, something had to be seriously wrong, or seriously interesting. He made a quick decision. The deer could wait. Trusting his dog was a rule he never broke. "Okay, buddy, show me," he said, his voice calm and steady. Arrow needed no further encouragement. He plunged into the thicket, forcing his way through the dense vegetation. Joe followed, the branches scratching at his face and clothes. The descent into the ravine was treacherous. The ground was steep and slick with damp moss, and he had to use his hands to steady himself, his rifle now a clumsy burden on his back. Arrow, more sure-footed, moved ahead, pausing every few moments to look back and make sure Joe was still following. The air in the ravine was heavy and still, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. It felt like a place forgotten by time. As they pushed deeper, Joe noticed a strange, unnatural line through the trees. It was a scar, a long gash where matured trees had been snapped like twigs years ago, though new growth had done its best to hide the wound. Arrow grew more agitated the deeper they went, whining and barking softly. Finally, he stopped at the base of the ravine, pawing at a wall of thick green vines that covered a large, dark shape. Joe came to a halt beside him, breathing heavily from the exertion. He pushed a curtain of vines aside, his heart pounding with a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread and curiosity. And then he saw it. It was not rock. It was metal. Rusted, dented, and scarred, but unmistakably metal. He tore away more of the vines, revealing a dark, olive-drab surface. A strange angular shape began to emerge, a form that was completely alien to the organic chaos of the forest. He saw a massive rotor hub, its blades snapped and twisted. He saw a long tail boom, broken and bent at an impossible angle. His breath caught in his throat. He knew this shape. He had seen it countless times before, in training manuals, in the skies over war zones. He was staring at the wreckage of an AH-64 Apache attack helicopter. It was half buried in the earth, tilted on its side like a slain beast. Nature had worked tirelessly to reclaim it, wrapping it in a shroud of green, but its violent mechanical skeleton remained. It was a tomb of steel, hidden away in the deep silence of the woods, a ghost of a war fought far from these peaceful mountains. Arrow stood beside him, silent now, as if he understood the gravity of their discovery. A heavy silence descended upon the ravine, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the faint breeze. The sight of the downed Apache sent a chill through Joe that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. It was a visceral reaction, a memory of twisted metal and the smell of fuel that his mind had tried to bury for years. For a long moment, he could only stare, his mind reeling. This was a machine of war, a predator from the sky, now lying broken and silent in the heart of a forest that should have never known its presence. Arrow, sensing the shift in his master's demeanor, moved closer, pressing his side against Joe's leg. The contact was enough to break the spell. Joe took a slow, deliberate breath, his Marine training kicking in, pushing the flood of emotions back and replacing it with a cold, analytical calm. He needed to be cautious. An old crash site could be dangerous, with sharp metal, unstable ground, and who knew what else. "Stay here, boy," he commanded softly, his hand resting briefly on Arrow's head. The dog whined but obeyed, sitting back on his haunches, his amber eyes tracking Joe's every move. Joe began a slow, careful circle of the wreckage. The helicopter was mangled, a testament to the violence of its final moments. One side was crushed against the steep wall of the ravine, while the other was exposed, its cockpit canopy shattered. He moved with practiced ease, his eyes scanning for any immediate threats. The years had stripped the wreckage of any leaking fluids, and time had settled the machine firmly into the earth. It was as stable as it was ever going to be. His approach to the cockpit was somber. The shattered acrylic offered a grim view of the interior. With a sense of duty he could not explain, Joe carefully pulled away a few more vines and peered inside. And there he was, the pilot. What was left of him was skeletal, still strapped into the pilot's seat, clad in the tattered remains of a flight suit. Joe felt a profound wave of sadness wash over him. This was a fellow soldier, a brother in arms, left to the lonely silence of the woods. He deserved better. Joe offered a silent prayer, a moment of respect for a man he never knew, but whose fate was now intertwined with his. His gaze swept over the cockpit, a chaotic mess of broken instruments and decaying upholstery. His military experience told him what to look for. Pilots often carried personal effects or mission-critical items in designated storage compartments. Most of the compartments had been torn open by the crash, their contents long since destroyed by the elements. But one caught his eye. It was a heavy-duty, standard-issue gear case, tucked under the co-pilot seat, seemingly intact. However, it was secured with a sturdy combination lock. Joe's curiosity warred with his reverence for the dead. What was inside? Why was it locked so securely? He tried to pull the case free, but it was wedged tightly. He needed leverage. Retreating from the wreckage, he found a fallen branch, thick and strong, and returned to the cockpit. Using the branch as a pry bar, he wedged it between the case and the twisted frame of the seat. He grunted with effort, the muscles in his back and shoulders straining. With a final, groaning screech of metal, the case broke free and tumbled onto the cockpit floor. He lifted it out of the helicopter and placed it on a patch of mossy ground. It was heavier than he expected. He examined the lock, but there was no obvious way to force it. He didn't have bolt cutters, and he wasn't about to fire his rifle at it. As he pondered the problem, Arrow, who had been watching patiently, got up and trotted over. He ignored the case Joe was focused on and began sniffing intently at the cockpit wreckage again. He whined, then began pawing insistently at a floor panel near the pilot's rudder pedals, a spot Joe had overlooked. "What is it, boy?" "Let it be," Joe said, distracted. But Arrow was persistent. He let out a low, insistent bark, scratching at the panel with more force. Joe sighed, his frustration giving way to his ingrained trust in the dog. He put the case down and went back to the cockpit one more time. He knelt, examining the spot Arrow was so obsessed with. It looked like any other part of the floor, but when he pressed down, he felt a slight give. Using the tip of his hunting knife, he pried at the edge. A hidden compartment, no bigger than a book, popped open. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was not a weapon or a piece of survival gear. It was a ruggedized military hard drive, wrapped in a sealed, waterproof bag. His heart began to beat faster. This was not standard equipment. This was something someone wanted to keep hidden and safe. Arrow barked again, a triumphant sound this time. He had found it. Joe carefully lifted the hard drive from its hiding place. Now the locked case seemed less important. This felt different. This felt like a secret. He looked from the hard drive in his hand to the silent pilot in the cockpit, then to the loyal dog at his side. The peaceful hunting trip had just taken a sharp, dangerous turn. He had stumbled upon a ghost, and now He was holding its legacy in his hands. The journey back to the cabin was shrouded in a tense silence, a stark contrast to the quiet peace of their outbound trek. The hunt was forgotten, replaced by the heavy weight of the hard drive nestled securely in Joe's pack. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, now seemed to carry a hint of menace. Arrow walked close to his side, his usual confident stride replaced with a watchful, protective gait, as if he too understood that the secret they carried had changed everything. They reached the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. But Joe found no comfort in the familiar sight. He immediately set to work, his movements driven by a new, urgent purpose. Inside, he powered up an old, durable laptop that he kept for emergencies, connecting it to the small satellite dish on the roof that provided his only link to the outside world. He took the hard drive from its waterproof bag. It was a solid piece of military hardware, designed to withstand the worst conditions imaginable. He plugged it into the laptop, his breath held in anticipation. A moment later, an icon appeared on the screen. But when he tried to access it, his screen was immediately filled with a complex security interface. It was military-grade encryption, a digital fortress with multiple layers of defense. A simple password prompt was the first gate, but beyond it, he could see prompts for biometric data, security tokens, and multi-factor authentication codes. It was impenetrable. A wave of frustration washed over him. He had faced down enemies on the battlefield, but this was a different kind of war, a silent battle against an unseen digital enemy. He spent hours trying to find a loophole, running diagnostic programs, and searching for any weakness, but the system was flawless. It was designed to keep secrets, and it was doing its job perfectly. Leaning back in his chair, he ran a hand through his hair, the weariness of the day settling deep into his bones. He stared at the screen, at the blinking cursor that seemed to mock him. A password was not enough. He needed a key, a physical key, and he knew with a sinking certainty that it had to be back at the crash site, with the pilot who had gone to such lengths to protect this information. Arrow, who had been sleeping at his feet, whined softly, sensing his master's distress. He got up and rested his heavy head on Joe's knee, his amber eyes full of concern. Joe stroked the dog's head, the simple act of connection, a small comfort in the overwhelming situation. "You're right, boy," Joe murmured, his decision solidifying. "We have to go back." They set out again before dawn, leaving the relative safety of the cabin behind. The return journey to the ravine felt different. Before, they were explorers stumbling upon a mystery. Now, they were investigators on a mission. Joe pushed them hard, his long strides eating up the miles, his focus narrowed to a single objective. When they finally arrived back at the forgotten tomb of the Apache, the place seemed darker, more foreboding. Joe approached the wreckage with a renewed sense of purpose. He had to think like the pilot. Where would a man hide the keys to his most important secret? He started with the cockpit, conducting a meticulous inch-by-inch search of the chaotic space. He ran his hands over every surface, checked every torn pocket, and peered into every dark corner, but found nothing. He felt a familiar despair begin to creep in. It was Arrow who broke the stalemate. The dog had been sniffing around the base of the pilot's seat, the same area where he had discovered the hidden compartment. He suddenly began to dig at the accumulated debris on the floor, whining with excitement. Joe moved over to investigate. Arrow was pawing at something small and metallic, nearly invisible against the dirt-caked floor. Joe carefully brushed the debris away. There, lying half-hidden, was a small, thin metal tag, like a dog tag, but smaller. He picked it up. It was cold to the touch. Engraved on its surface was a cryptic sequence of letters and numbers. A 1Z26 K11R18. It wasn't a password. It was a cipher, a clue. Joe's mind raced. In the military, they used simple substitution ciphers like this for low-level field encryption. A 1Z26 meant A equals 1, Z equals 26. So the sequence translated to ZKR. It was a start, but it wasn't enough to unlock the drive. This was only part of the key. His gaze fell upon the pilot's remains. A grim thought entered his mind. If you wanted to hide something so no one would ever find it, you would keep it as close as possible. With a quiet apology to the fallen soldier, Joe leaned into the cockpit and gently examined the tattered flight suit. He focused on the collar, a place where soldiers often sewed in small personal items. His fingers traced the lining and he felt it, a small, hard ridge that was out of place. With the steady hand of a surgeon, he used his knife to carefully slice open the thick stitches. He reached inside the lining and his fingers closed around a small, flexible object. He pulled it out. It was a thin strip of polymer, like microfilm, with another sequence printed on it. This one purely numerical. The 1st of July 2019. A date. He held the two pieces in his hand, the metal tag from the floor and the date strip from the collar. ZKR and a date. Separately, they were meaningless. But together, he had a feeling they formed the first key to unlocking the pilot's legacy. He had passed the first test. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Joe and Arrow made their way back to the cabin for the final time. The weight in Joe's pack was no longer just a physical burden. It was a weight on his soul. He carried a dead man's secret, and now he held the fragile keys that might unlock it. The pieces felt small and insignificant in his hand, a thin metal tag and a flimsy strip of polymer, but together they represented the pilot's last desperate act. Back inside the cabin, the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke did little to calm his frayed nerves. He sat down at the small wooden table, the laptop open and waiting. Arrow lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, but his body was tense, a coiled spring of watchful energy. He seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Joe took a deep breath, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He looked at the two pieces of the puzzle, Z, K, R, and the date, the 1st of July 2019. He tried the most logical combination first, entering the letters followed by the numbers, with no spaces or dashes. ZKR 070120119. He hit enter. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The blinking cursor on the security interface continued its relentless, mocking pulse. He felt a surge of disappointment. Then, with a soft click, the screen changed. The complex matrix of security prompts vanished, replaced by a simple, clean file directory. He was in. A wave of relief so profound, it almost made him dizzy, washed over him. He had passed the first gate. "Good boy, Arrow," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We did it." The directory was meticulously organized, with folders labeled with military precision: manifests, comms, logistics, intel. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the first file. It was a shipping manifest, detailing a transfer of surplus military hardware. But as he read further, a cold dread began to seep into his bones. The equipment listed was not surplus. It was state-of-the-art weaponry, surface-to-air missiles, advanced sniper rifles, encrypted communication gear. The destination was listed as a secure U.S. military base in Germany. But the routing codes and transfer protocols were all wrong. They were falsified, expertly disguised to look legitimate. He clicked on the comms folder. It contained encrypted audio logs. He found a decryption key in a separate text file and ran the program. A woman's voice, cold, crisp, and laced with an unmistakable air of authority, filled the small cabin. She spoke in coded language, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. She was discussing prices, delivery windows, and plausible deniability with a man whose accent was distinctly Eastern European. The final folder, Intel, contained a single, password-protected video file. The password was the pilot's last name, which Joe had found on the tattered remains of his flight suit, Weber. The video flickered to life. It was a covertly recorded meeting in a lavish, modern office. The same woman from the audio logs was seated behind a large glass desk. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent features, impeccably styled dark hair, and eyes that were as cold and hard as polished steel. A small nameplate on her desk read, "Isabella Reed, CEO, Aegis Tactical Solutions." Joe knew the name. Aegis Tactical was one of the largest private military contractors in the world, a corporate giant with immense political influence. In the video, Reed was finalizing a deal, the same deal from the manifests and comms. She was selling advanced American weapons to a known terrorist network, a group responsible for the deaths of American soldiers. Joe felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't just a crime. It was the highest form of treason, a betrayal paid for with the blood of men he had served with. The pilot, Weber, must have discovered the truth and tried to expose it, a heroic act that had cost him his life. What Joe didn't know, couldn't know, was that the hard drive was a trap. The moment he had successfully bypassed that first layer of security, a tiny, deeply embedded program had executed its one and only function. It sent a single, infinitesimally small data packet through the satellite connection, a digital flare containing one piece of information, the IP address of his remote cabin. The trap had been sprung, silently and invisibly. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia and indecision. Joe felt trapped. He couldn't go to the authorities. Reed's influence ran too deep. Who could he trust? The knowledge he possessed was a poison, isolating him completely. He barely ate, and sleep offered no escape, only nightmares. It was Arrow who first sensed the new danger. The dog became restless, his usual calm demeanor gone. He would spend hours pacing the perimeter of the cabin, or standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods, his head cocked, listening to something Joe couldn't hear. A low, persistent growl would rumble in his chest, and the fur along his spine would bristle. On the third day, Joe was outside chopping wood when Arrow suddenly froze, his gaze fixed on the sky. He let out a single, sharp bark. "What is it?" Joe asked, following his gaze. At first, he saw nothing but the vast, empty blue. Then, he caught it, a flicker of movement. It was a tiny, dark speck, almost invisible against the brilliance of the sky. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, without sound. It was a drone. A cold certainty washed over him. It wasn't a hobbyist's toy or a forestry service drone. It was military grade, a silent observer, an eye in the sky. It was looking for him. He and Arrow stood frozen in the clearing, two small figures in a vast wilderness, staring up at the unblinking eye of the hunter. They were no longer hidden. They had been found. The drone hung in the sky for what felt like an eternity, a malevolent black star in the daylight. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it retreated, disappearing back into the vast emptiness of the sky. But its message had been delivered with chilling clarity. They were exposed. The sanctuary Joe had so carefully built for himself was no longer safe. The enemy knew where he was, and they would be coming. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up his throat, but years of training slammed it back down. He was a Marine. You don't panic. You assess, you adapt, you act. "Inside, boy. Now," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. Arrow needed no second bidding. He was already moving toward the cabin, his body low to the ground. The fur on his back still bristled. Once inside, Joe locked the heavy wooden door and bolted the shutters over the windows, plunging the small cabin into a gloomy twilight. The drone was just the scout. The real threat would come under the cover of darkness. He had hours, maybe less. Every second was precious. He moved with an economy of motion that was purely instinctual, a ghost of the soldier he once was awakening from a long slumber. First, he pulled out his old military rucksack from a storage chest, a bug-out bag he had packed years ago and thankfully never needed. He checked the contents: a water purifier, medical supplies, high-energy food rations, a compass, fire starters, and a spare box of ammunition for his rifle. He added the pilot's hard drive, wrapping it in an oilskin cloth and burying it deep inside. Next, he prepared the cabin for a defense. It wasn't a fortress, but he could make it a hard target. He moved the heavy oak table to brace the front door and positioned the 2 armchairs to provide cover from the windows. He laid out his hunting rifle and his sidearm, a well-maintained Colt 1911, on the floor beside him, along with all the ammunition he had. It wasn't much. As dusk settled, a deep, unnatural quiet fell over the forest. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs was silent, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. Joe sat in the darkness, his back against the wall, rifle across his lap. Arrow lay beside him, a tense, silent shadow. The dog's ears twitched, rotating to catch the faintest sounds, his nose constantly sampling the air. He was a living early warning system, more reliable than any piece of technology. Hours crept by. The moon rose, casting long, eerie shadows through the cracks in the shutters. Joe's senses were on high alert, his body thrumming with adrenaline. He was back in the Fallujah, waiting for the inevitable attack that came with the night. The only difference was the steady, warm presence of the dog at his side. Then it came. Arrow's head shot up. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound so deep it was more felt than heard. Joe's hand immediately went to the dog's back, a silent command to stay quiet. Arrow obeyed, but his entire body was a quivering mass of focused intensity. Joe heard it a second later, the faintest crunch of a boot on dry leaves. Not a clumsy hiker, but the deliberate, weighted step of a professional. One was a threat. More than one was a team. Suddenly, Arrow exploded into a frenzy of ferocious barking, a deafening alarm in the suffocating silence. He threw himself against the door, his barks echoing through the small cabin. That was the signal. The assault began. A heavy thud hit the door, a battering ram. The wood groaned but held, the oak table behind it, scraping against the floor. Another thud, harder this time. Splinters flew inward. At the same time, the sound of shattering glass came from the side window as the butt of a rifle smashed through the shutter. Joe didn't wait. He was already moving, rolling to his right as the first shots tore through the thin wooden walls, chewing up the space where he had been moments before. He raised his own rifle, aimed for the black square of the broken window, and fired 2 controlled shots. A sharp cry from outside told him he had found his mark. But he knew it was a losing fight. They were professionals, equipped with night vision and automatic weapons. He had a hunting rifle and a handful of bullets. He wasn't trying to win, he was trying to survive. He needed a distraction, an escape. He crawled toward the back of the cabin, staying below the line of fire. "Arrow, window," he hissed, pointing toward the small secondary window in his sleeping area. "Go, get 'em." Arrow understood immediately. He was not just a pet, he was a partner. With a final defiant bark, he leaped onto the bed, scrambled through the small opening, and disappeared into the night. A moment later, a cacophony of snarling, barking, and shouting erupted from the side of the house. The distraction. Joe seized the opportunity. He grabbed his rucksack and his pistol, leaving the heavier rifle behind. He smashed the rest of the back window with his boot and scrambled through, landing in a crouch in the deep shadows behind the cabin. The sounds of the main assault were still focused on the front, while the chaos Arrow was creating had pulled at least one of the attackers away. He moved silently, melting into the familiar darkness of the forest that had been his home. 100 yards in, he let out a low, 2-toned whistle. A moment later, a gray and white shape detached itself from the shadows and loped to his side. It was Arrow, unharmed. Behind them, the night was torn apart by shouts and the bright flashes of gunfire as the mercenaries realized their target was gone. Joe didn't look back. He put a hand on Arrow's head, a silent thank you, and together, man and dog disappeared into the deep, unforgiving wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. The hunt had begun. The forest swallowed them whole. One moment, They were illuminated by the chaotic flashes of gunfire behind them. The next, they were wrapped in the absolute primeval darkness of the Appalachian night. They ran, not with speed, but with a desperate, ground-eating urgency. Joe's lungs burned, and every step sent a jolt of pain through his exhausted body, but he pushed onward, driven by pure adrenaline and the primal need to survive. Arrow ran at his side, a silent gray phantom, his paws making almost no sound on the forest floor. They moved for what felt like hours, putting as much distance and difficult terrain as possible between themselves and the smoldering remains of Joe's life. He used the stars to navigate, heading deeper into the trackless wilderness, away from any trail or road the mercenaries might use to follow them. Finally, when the moon was high and the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness, he found a small, defensible hollow beneath a rocky overhang. "Okay, boy. Rest," he whispered, his voice raspy. He sank to the ground, his back against the cold stone, and pulled the rucksack into his lap. Arrow immediately took up a watch position at the edge of the hollow, his body oriented toward the direction they had come, his ears swiveling to catch every whisper of the wind. Even in his exhaustion, the dog was a sentinel. Joe's mind raced. His cabin was gone. His quiet life was shattered. They were being hunted by a team of highly trained killers, backed by a corporation with limitless resources. He was one man with a pistol and a dog. The odds were impossible. He needed more than just to run. He needed a destination, a purpose. He needed a plan. He pulled out the ruggedized laptop and the hard drive. The laptop's battery was critically low, the icon flashing a desperate red. He had one chance. He plugged in the drive, the familiar security interface appearing on the screen. He entered the code, ZKR070122019, and the file directory opened. This time, he wasn't looking at the evidence itself. He was looking for the pilot's plan. What was Weber's endgame? He scanned the folders again. Manifests, comms, intel. But then he saw a file he had overlooked in his initial shock. A corrupted system log file named nav log partial at. Most of it was unreadable garbage text, scrambled by the crash. But Joe's eyes, trained to find patterns in chaos, caught something. Buried deep within the corrupted data was a single clean line of text that had survived intact. It was a string of numbers. 38,300, 83 десятитысячных N, 79,1700, 22 десятитысячных W. He stared at the numbers, his heart beginning to pound with a new, fragile hope. They were GPS coordinates. This wasn't just data, it was a map. Weber hadn't just gathered proof, he had created a contingency. This had to be the location of a backup, a physical copy of the evidence hidden somewhere far from prying digital eyes. It was a dead drop, a final, posthumous move in a deadly game of chess. He powered down the laptop just as the battery died, saving the precious screen image in his mind. The location was deep in the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest, a notoriously rugged and remote section of the mountains. It was more than 100 miles away as the crow flies, and far more on foot through the unforgiving terrain. The decision was made. They were no longer just running from something, they were running to something. The journey began the next morning. It was a brutal, grueling trek. They were fugitives now, and they had to move like ghosts. They stayed off the trails, bushwhacking through dense thickets of rhododendron, scrambling up steep, rocky inclines, and wading through ice-cold mountain streams to cover their scent. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching enemy. Joe pushed them to their physical limits. He rationed their small supply of food, giving the larger share to Arrow, whose strength and senses were their most valuable assets. The dog was more than a companion. He was a vital piece of their survival gear. Arrow's nose was constantly in the air, his ears twitching. He would often freeze, a low growl rumbling in his chest, long before Joe could see or hear anything. Each time, they would melt into the undergrowth, holding their breath until the perceived danger, a distant sound or a flicker of movement, had passed. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of walking, hiding, and fitful paranoid sleep. Joe's face became leaner, his eyes sunken but sharp, constantly scanning his surroundings. He was shedding the skin of the quiet recluse and becoming the soldier he had tried so hard to bury. On the fourth day, as they were traversing a high, windswept ridge, Arrow suddenly flattened himself to the ground, whining softly. Joe dropped beside him, peering through the sparse trees. Far below, on a dirt access road that snaked through the valley, he saw them. Two black unmarked ATVs were moving slowly, kicking up dust. There were 4 men, dressed in tactical gear, their rifles held at the ready. One of them held a device, a tracker, sweeping it across the landscape. A cold dread washed over Joe. They were being actively hunted. They hadn't just given up after the cabin. They were professionals. He and Arrow lay motionless for nearly an hour, pressed into the earth, until the patrol had moved on and disappeared around a bend. The close call was a stark reminder that they were not just fighting the wilderness. They were fighting an enemy that would not stop. That night, as they huddled together for warmth beneath a thicket of pines, the weight of their situation pressed down on Joe. He looked at Arrow, whose head was resting on his paws, but whose eyes were open and alert, watching over him. The dog had saved his life, had followed him without hesitation into this nightmare, his loyalty absolute and unquestioning. Joe reached out and stroked the dog's head, a silent promise passing between them. They were in this together, until the very end. He had no idea if they would survive, or if what they found at those coordinates would make any difference. But as he looked out at the endless sea of mountains stretching before them, he knew they had to try. They had to honor the pilot's sacrifice. They had to see it through. 2 more days, 48 hours of near constant movement, of hunger that had become a dull, persistent ache, and of a weariness that had settled deep into Joe's bones. The close call on the ridge had changed the nature of their flight. They were no longer just moving toward a destination. They were actively evading a known, relentless pursuit. They moved mostly at night now, using the darkness as their cloak, resting during the day in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the forest. Joe's internal compass, honed by years of land navigation, told him they were close. The terrain had grown steeper, the forest thicker, and the air carried the damp, earthy smell of deep, undisturbed wilderness. On the morning of the 7th day since fleeing the cabin, they heard it. A low, distant rumble, a sound that was not the wind or an animal, but a constant, powerful roar. "Water. We're close, boy," Joe whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He gave Arrow the last of their jerky. The dog devoured it in seconds, his energy reserves nearly as depleted as Joe's. But the sound of the water seemed to invigorate them both. It was a signpost, a promise that their grueling journey might soon have a purpose. They followed the sound for another hour, the rumble growing into a thunderous roar that vibrated through the soles of Joe's boots. They broke through a final, dense thicket of mountain laurel and stopped dead in their tracks. Before them was a breathtaking sight. A massive waterfall cascaded down a sheer cliff face, a 100-foot curtain of white water plunging into a deep, emerald pool below, sending a perpetual mist into the air. This had to be the place. Finding the entrance was the next challenge. The coordinates were precise, but a cave hidden behind a waterfall was a classic hiding spot for a reason. It was hard to find. Joe and Arrow spent the next hour carefully scouting the perimeter. The rock face was slick with moss and spray, treacherous to navigate. It was Arrow who found it. The dog, despite his exhaustion, was restlessly sniffing along the base of the cliff just to the right of the main cascade. He began to whine and paw at a section of rock that was almost completely obscured by a thick wall of hanging ferns and dripping moss. Joe pushed aside the curtain of wet greenery. Behind it was a narrow, dark fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. It was the entrance. A blast of cool, damp air flowed out, carrying the scent of wet stone and ancient earth. "Good boy," Joe breathed, giving Arrow a rough pat on the head. "Let's see what Weber left for us." He took out a small flashlight from his rucksack, its beam cutting a weak but welcome path into the darkness. The cave was not deep. It was more of a large, single chamber, the roar of the waterfall, a deafening, constant presence just outside. In the center of the chamber, placed carefully on a flat, dry rock, was a black, hard-shelled pelican case. It was military grade, designed to be waterproof, shockproof, and completely unassuming. With trembling hands, Joe knelt and unfastened the heavy latches. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was the pilot's legacy. On one side lay a thick stack of papers, each sheet sealed in a waterproof sleeve. They were the original, hard-copy documents, the falsified shipping manifests, the incriminating communication transcripts, the internal memos signed by Isabella Reed herself. This was the physical proof, undeniable and damning. On the other side was a small, ruggedized memory card, identical to the one in his possession, but this one was labeled Video Evidence. He knew it held the recording of Reed's treasonous meeting. Beneath it lay a final item, a thick, vacuum-sealed envelope. Joe carefully removed the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a handwritten note from Weber and a folded, laminated map of the local region. He read the note, his eyes scanning the neat, precise block letters. "If you are reading this, I am already dead. Reed found out I was compiling this evidence. The crash was no accident. Do not trust the agency. Do not trust the military command. Her network is everywhere. The only person I could trust is a journalist named Ben Carter. He knows the risks. I have hidden a satellite phone for him in an old, abandoned coal mine, a place called the Widow's Maw. The location is marked on the map. It's my last resort. There is an escape route through this cave system that leads directly into the mine. It is your only way out. Godspeed, Cap T. Weber." A satellite phone, an escape route, a single, trusted contact. It was a complete contingency plan, the final move of a brilliant, desperate man. Joe stared at the map. The Widow's Maw was miles away, a labyrinth of abandoned tunnels deep in the mountainside. He was so engrossed in the discovery, so lost in the dead pilot's final words, that he almost missed the signal. It was Arrow. The dog, who had been lying quietly at the mouth of the cave, suddenly shot to his feet. A low, menacing growl, deeper and more threatening than any Joe had ever heard from him, rumbled in his chest. His body was rigid, the fur along his spine standing on end, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. He was not looking out at the waterfall, but staring intently back at the narrow entrance through which they had come. Joe's blood ran cold. He froze, straining his ears, trying to hear past the thunderous roar of the water. And then he heard it. A sound that did not belong. The metallic scrape of a boot on stone, quickly muffled. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. They had been tracked. The mercenaries were outside, blocking the only entrance. They were trapped. Joe looked from Arrow's tense form to the life-saving contents of the case, then to the dark, gaping maw of the escape tunnel at the back of the cave that the map indicated. They were cornered, with the hunters on one side and the deep, unknown darkness of the earth on the other. There was only one way to go. There was no time for hesitation. The scrape of the boot outside was a death sentence. In one swift, desperate motion, Joe grabbed the pelican case, dumped its precious contents into his rucksack, and cinched it tight. The hard-shelled case was too bulky, too slow. The documents, the memory card, the map, and the pilot's final note were all that mattered. "This way, Arrow," he commanded, his voice barely a whisper against the roar of the waterfall. He clicked on his small flashlight, its beam a fragile sword against the suffocating darkness of the escape tunnel. He didn't look back. Arrow was right at his heels, a reassuring pressure against his leg as they plunged into the throat of the mountain. The transition was jarring. The air immediately grew cold and stale, thick with the smell of coal dust, damp earth, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The thunder of the waterfall faded behind them, replaced by the sound of their own frantic heartbeats and the drip, drip, drip of water seeping through ancient rock. They were in the widow's maw. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing Joe to stoop. It was a natural passage at first, but soon it opened into a man-made tunnel, the walls supported by rotting wooden beams. This was the beginning of the labyrinth. Passages branched off in every direction, a disorienting maze of black mouths leading to nowhere and everywhere. The laminated map was their only guide, but in the near-total darkness, it was almost useless. He switched off the flashlight to conserve the battery, plunging them into absolute blackness. He ran his hand along the cold, wet wall, shuffling forward one step at a time. The real pursuit began. Distant, muffled shouts echoed down the tunnels, followed by the blinding white beams of powerful tactical flashlights sweeping across the darkness far behind them. His heart hammered against his ribs. They were coming. This was no longer a chase through a forest, Joe knew like the back of his hand. This was a hunt in a subterranean tomb, an alien environment where the rules had changed. Here, sight was a luxury, and sound was a traitor. But Joe had an advantage his hunters did not. He had Arrow. The dog moved with a preternatural confidence in the dark. His senses, already sharp, were magnified 100-fold in the absence of light. He became Joe's eyes and his ears. Arrow pressed against Joe's left leg, his tail down, giving a low, almost inaudible whine. He was sensing something. Joe froze. Every muscle tensed. Arrow nudged his head insistently down a narrow, crumbling passage to their right. Trusting the dog's instincts over his own, Joe changed direction. Moments later, the beams of 2 flashlights sliced through the main tunnel they had just abandoned. The cat-and-mouse game began in earnest. The mercenaries were skilled, spreading out to cover the main arteries of the mine. But the widow's maw was a chaotic web of countless, smaller, forgotten tunnels, and Arrow, with his nose to the ground and ears pricked, guided them through this secret network. He could smell the subtle changes in air currents, hear the faint crunch of gravel under a boot from 100 yards away. He was a living, breathing compass of survival. For an hour they twisted and turned through the suffocating darkness, always one step ahead of the sweeping lights. But Joe knew they couldn't run forever. They had to fight back. They had to turn the darkness from a prison into a weapon. He found a junction of 4 tunnels, a perfect place for an ambush. He pulled out his pistol, the cold steel a grim comfort in his hand. He knelt, placing a hand on Arrow's back. The dog stood perfectly still, his head cocked, listening. A faint, rhythmic sound began to echo from the tunnel to their left. The sound of careful, deliberate footsteps. One man, coming alone. Joe's training took over. He wasn't Joe the Recluse anymore. He was Sergeant Miller of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion. He positioned himself in the deep shadows of an adjacent tunnel, the pistol held steady in a 2-handed grip. Arrow lay flat, a silent shadow at his feet. The footsteps grew louder. A beam of light preceded the soldier, illuminating the damp walls. The mercenary stepped into the junction, sweeping his rifle from side to side. As his back turned for a fraction of a second, Joe moved. He exploded from the darkness, a blur of motion. He didn't fire a shot. The sound would give away their position to the others. Instead, he struck the man at the base of the skull with the butt of his pistol. The mercenary crumpled to the ground without a sound. Joe dragged him into the shadows, quickly stripping him of his gear. An M4 rifle with a suppressor, 3 extra magazines, a radio, and, most importantly, a pair of night vision goggles. He strapped the goggles over his head and flipped them down. The world bloomed into a grainy, ethereal green. The darkness was gone. He could see every rock, every rotting timber, every drop of water glistening on the walls. He looked at Arrow, who stared back, his eyes glowing like 2 pale moons. The odds had just begun to even out. They continued their silent journey, moving with newfound confidence. 20 minutes later, Arrow stopped again, pressing his body against Joe's leg and pointing his nose down a long, straight tunnel. Joe peered through the goggles. At the far end, nearly 200 yards away, another mercenary had set up a listening post, kneeling behind a collapsed minecart. Joe formulated a plan. He looked at Arrow and pointed down a side tunnel that ran parallel to the main one. "Go around," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Make a noise." Arrow seemed to understand perfectly. He disappeared silently into the side passage. Joe raised the suppressed M4, resting it on a pile of rubble for stability. He waited. A minute passed. Then, from far down the tunnel and to the left of the mercenary, came the distinct sound of a single, sharp bark, followed by the clatter of falling stones. The mercenary flinched, immediately swiveling his rifle toward the sound of the disturbance. It was the only opening Joe needed. He exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and sent a single, subsonic round through the darkness. The suppressed shot was a dull cough, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the mine. The mercenary slumped over, his light extinguished. 2 down. Joe reloaded, his movements fluid and precise. He gave a low whistle, and a moment later, Arrow trotted out of the darkness and back to his side. Man and dog stood together in the ghostly green silence of the mine. They were no longer the hunted, they were the hunters, and the labyrinth was now their territory. The silence that followed the second shot was heavier, more profound than the darkness it replaced. 2 down. Joe knelt, one hand resting on Arrow's steady back, the other holding the captured radio to his ear. He listened, breathing shallowly through his mouth, filtering out the endless drip of water and the groan of ancient timbers. For a long moment, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice crackled through the earpiece, calm and laced with cold fury. "Kilo, Sierra, report." Silence. "Kilo Sierra, status now," the voice repeated, sharper this time. It was the leader. Joe could hear the controlled professionalism, the mind of a predator recalculating its attack. "He's got comms," another, younger voice finally replied, his transmission shaky. "Sierra's down. Kilo is dark. Fall back to extraction point Bravo. Rendezvous in 5, the leader commanded. "We burn the asset and scrub the site. No witnesses." Joe's blood ran cold. They weren't just retreating, they were planning to collapse the mine entrance, burying him, Arrow, and the truth forever. He looked at the laminated map under the green glow of the night vision. The maintenance station, where the satellite phone was hidden, was deeper in, near a massive central chamber. The extraction point would be near the main entrance they had been driven from. He and the remaining 2 mercenaries were now moving toward the same general area on a collision course. He had to get to that phone. It was the only move left on the board. "Let's go, boy," he whispered. "Time to finish this." They moved with a new urgency, no longer just hiding, but actively hunting. Joe used the map and Arrow's senses to navigate the labyrinth, aiming for the large central chamber that served as the mine's hub. It was a vast, cavernous space where multiple tunnels converged, the ceiling soaring 100 feet into the darkness, supported by a forest of thick, decaying pillars. Old machinery, rusted and skeletal, lay scattered like the bones of forgotten giants. As they entered the chamber, Arrow stopped, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Joe saw them through his goggles. The 2 remaining mercenaries were at the far side of the chamber, planting explosive charges on the main support pillars. The leader was a tall, lean man who moved with an efficient, deadly grace. The younger one was nervous, fumbling with the wiring. This was his only chance. He raised the M4, but the leader was good. Too good. Before Joe could get a clean shot, the man spun around as if sensing him, his own night vision goggles glowing like a demon's eyes. "Contact!" he yelled, and the chamber erupted in a deafening roar of automatic fire. Joe dove behind a massive rusted gear, bullets sparking off the metal inches from his head. Arrow flattened himself to the ground, snarling. They were pinned down. The acoustics of the vast chamber turned the gunfire into a disorienting, echoing thunder. The leader and the younger mercenary split up, using the pillars and old equipment for cover, expertly flanking him. Joe was trapped in a classic pincer movement. He returned fire, the suppressed coughs of his M4 answered by the loud, unsilenced blasts of their rifles. He knew he was outgunned. He risked a glance around the gear. The younger mercenary was moving to his left, trying to get a better angle. Joe fired a short burst, forcing him back behind cover. But it was a feint. The leader used that moment to advance on the right, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Joe turned to face the new threat, but he was too late. The leader was already there, a dark silhouette against the green haze. He brought his rifle up. Joe knew he wouldn't miss at this range. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the muzzle flash, felt a searing, white-hot pain tear through his left shoulder, and was thrown backward by the impact, his rifle clattering to the ground. Pain exploded in his arm. The world swam in a nauseating green blur. He tried to reach for his pistol, but his arm wouldn't respond. The leader was advancing on him, his rifle aimed at Joe's head for the final, killing shot. This was it. It was over. But it wasn't. From the shadows beside him, a gray and white blur of fur and fury erupted with a sound that was not a bark, but a savage roar of pure, protective rage. Arrow launched himself through the air, a 65-pound missile of muscle and teeth, and slammed into the mercenary leader. The man screamed, a sound of shock and agony as Arrow's jaws clamped down on his gun arm. The rifle flew from his grasp. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and snapping teeth. The leader struggled, trying to draw his sidearm, but Arrow was relentless, shaking his head violently, his entire being focused on neutralizing the threat to his master. Joe, gasping through the pain, saw his chance. He grabbed his pistol with his good hand, aimed at the struggling shape of the younger mercenary, who was now aiming at the dog, and fired twice. The man went down. He staggered to his feet, his vision clearing, and pointed his pistol at the leader, who had finally managed to throw Arrow off and was scrambling for his rifle. "Don't," Joe said, his voice a ragged gasp. The leader froze, looking from the pistol to the snarling German shepherd standing guard over Joe, ready to launch himself again. He slowly raised his empty hands. It was finally over. Using zip ties from the mercenary's gear, Joe secured the leader. He then tended to Arrow, who was thankfully uninjured, before crudely bandaging his own bleeding shoulder. The pain was immense, but his mind was clear. Following the map, he and Arrow made their way to the maintenance station, a small, brick-walled room deep in the mine. And there, tucked inside a rusted old toolbox, exactly as the pilot's note had described, was the satellite phone. He powered it on. After a moment, it beeped, connecting to a network high above the earth. His hands shaking from pain and adrenaline, he dialed the number for the journalist, Ben Carter. A voice answered. "Carter, you don't know me," Joe began, his words spilling out in a rush. "My name is Joe Miller. I'm a friend of Captain Thomas Weber. I have everything. The manifests, the comms, a video. I'm sending it to you now." He transmitted the files. Then, for the first time in a decade, Joe Miller asked for help. The sun was blinding when the FBI tactical team, guided by the journalist's information and the phone's GPS, finally led him and Arrow out of the widow's maw 2 days later. The story broke like a dam. The evidence was irrefutable. Isabella Reed was arrested in a dawn raid on her Virginia estate. Her corporation imploded, taking down a network of corrupt officials with it. Captain Weber was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, his name cleared, and his sacrifice honored. Months later, the Appalachian autumn was painting the mountains in hues of gold and crimson. A new log cabin, built with funds from a grateful government and the Weber family, stood where the old one had been burned. Smoke curled from its chimney. Joe sat on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his good hand, his shoulder still healing. He looked different. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, hard-won peace. Arrow lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, his gray and white coat shining in the afternoon sunday. He looked up at Joe, his intelligent eyes soft, and nudged his hand. Joe smiled, a real, genuine smile, and stroked the dog's head. They had been through the fire and into the labyrinth, and had come out the other side. Here, in the quiet stillness of the mountains, surrounded by the echoes of the past, they had finally found their way home. In the quietest moments and the loudest storms, it is often the unwavering loyalty of a true friend that gives us the strength to carry on. The bond between Joe and Arrow is a powerful reminder of this simple, profound truth. If their story of courage and companionship moved you, we invite you to become part of our community by subscribing to the channel. Your likes, comments, and shares help these tales find a home in the hearts of others. A new adventure is ready to begin right now, just a click away on your screen. We hope to see you there.